Welcome, dear friends. I'm Father John Deere, and welcome to this Beatitude Center Zoom session with our special guest today, Dr. Lerita Coleman Brown. You can find many other great upcoming Zooms at beatitudecenter.org. Let me first ask and remind everyone to please mute yourselves and to write any questions in the chat link. And I'm hoping Dr. Lerita Coleman Brown will speak at least 45 minutes, and then we'll open up for questions and conversations, and we'll finish at the hour and a half. And later this week, we'll send out the Zoom recording link. And after the recording finishes, I myself will stay on for a few minutes if anybody wants to debrief. So as we usually do, let's begin with a, a little prayer. So I invite you to take a deep breath and just relax and notice how you're feeling today. And breathe in that Holy Spirit of peace, and let's each one of us enter into the presence of the God of peace who loves you infinitely, unconditionally, wonderfully as you are. And let's welcome the risen, nonviolent Jesus here into our circle and ask for whatever graces and blessings we need and for the world. Beloved God, thank you for all the blessings of life and love and peace that you give us for this new day and this moment. Be with us now as we reflect with our friend Dr. Lerita Coleman Brown on the life and teachings of your servant Howard Thurman, that we might deepen in spiritual wisdom and become sacred activists for justice, equality, discernment, and peace, rooted in you, acting from the springs within. Disarm us, heal us, inspire us, enlighten us, and strengthen us to go forward in universal love and peace, that we might do your will and welcome your reign of peace on earth, and do our part to help end violence, war, racism, poverty, sexism, environmental destruction, that we might welcome your reign of peace and be authentic followers of the nonviolent Jesus, the people you have called us to be, your beatitude peacemakers, your beloved sons and daughters. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So again, a very warm welcome to everybody. And I'm still kind of poking around here on the screen. We were recording this on October 26, 2024. And a terrible moment in the country and the world. And as we're facing the national election, again, I remind everyone to please mute yourselves if you can. And as we look in the days ahead, it's going to be very easy to give into despair and to be paralyzed and to give up. That is not the way of the nonviolent Jesus. That is not the message of the Beatitudes, as we've talked about in the past, which begin in the Aramaic, arise and go forth. And that's why I'm so thrilled to introduce our speaker today, who can help us with this great challenge in this moment. So it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Lerita Coleman Brown to the Beatitude Center. She's one of the leading scholars on Howard Thurman, and will reflect on his life and wisdom and whatever she wants to say to us, based on her book, her great book, which I hope you all get. The title is from his great teaching, What Makes You Come Alive? A Spiritual Walk with Howard Thurman. I have, Lerita, spent the summer preparing for your Zoom. Of all the hundreds of Zooms, I've never done this before. Howard Thurman, well, let me just look at my notes so I get this right. He's going to tell us about, is really one of the most important theologians, mystics, civil rights leaders, and spiritual teachers in U.S. history. He was a friend of Gandhi who told him that perhaps the only way nonviolence would break open into the world. The only way nonviolence would break open into the world would be through a leading African American. And then Howard Thurman becomes the teacher and friend and mentor of Martin Luther King, who called Thurman the architect of the civil rights movement. And Lerita will explain all this, but that's because of this great classic book, which I first read in 1982. And I bought a new copy, Lerita, in your honor, and reread it and studied it this morning. And you know, every march, apparently, that Martin Luther King went on, he carried his copy with him. Now, he didn't have, Gandhi or Dr. King didn't have all the great new books out on Jesus and peace and love and nonviolence, starting with John Howard Yoder. This was it, and it's a great book, and it still holds up. And so this is really great. His autobiography, With Head and Heart, the autobiography of Howard Thurman, and then Dr. Coleman Brown's new great book on his teachings. So Dr. Lerita Coleman Brown is Professor Emerita of Psychology at Agnes Scott College. She's a spiritual director, retreat leader, and speaker. She earned her BA from UC Santa Cruz and her PhD from Harvard University. She appears in the documentaries Back Against the Wall, the Howard Thurman story, and The Black Church, This Is Our Story, This Is Our Song. Her book, When the Heart Speaks, Listen, Discovering Inner Wisdom, was published in 2019, and I urge you all to take a look at her website, LeritaColemanBrown.com. So, dear friends, please join me in giving a big, warm Zoom welcome to Dr. Lerita Coleman Brown. The floor is yours, Lerita. Thank you for joining us. I'll mute myself.
Thank you so much, Father John, dear. It's just been just so lovely to have this opportunity to speak to you all. And I just want to say good morning to those of you who are, for which it is morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm sure that people are tuning in from a variety of places. It's sort of middle of the afternoon where I am in Atlanta, Georgia. And I'm thrilled to be able to share I'm sure a few new insights that Father John may not know about with respect to Howard Thurman. So let's just say that I had no intention of writing a book about Howard Thurman. I actually stumbled across him in 2008 when I was looking for a subject for my final project for my spiritual direction training program at the Shalem Institute. And we studied quite a few mystics there, but I just was curious about whether or not in the history of the world, if there had been any African or African-American mystics, because I had not read about any. And I started asking around, and one of my clergy friends said, "You mean you haven't heard about Howard Thurman?" And I had not heard about Howard Thurman, and I was just really shocked and dismayed to discover that we both lived in the Bay Area of California at the same time and didn't know about him, so I didn't get a chance to meet him when he was alive. And nonetheless, I started reading. I was particularly, I think one of the first books that I got was Meditations of the Heart. And I started sort of reading him, and I just thought, wow, there's a lot here, this beautiful wisdom in this poetic prose. So then my friend Carl Coleman actually encouraged me to start leading some retreats on him. And what I discovered when I was out there sort of on the road is that there were a lot of spiritual seekers who seemed to resonate with some of the words and wisdom that Howard Thurman shared, but they didn't know about him either. So I just felt like that it was time to put together something that was for spiritual seekers, people that go to retreats and conferences and places like that. There had been a number of books written about him by academics and academic scholars. And that's, it was fine. And of course, he's written a number of books himself, but part of the issue at hand was to to expose him to more people. So I'm going to share my screen here, and I put together a few little pictures to go along with what I want to share about him today. So I will say that I was, sort of at home minding my own business, and I received out of the blue a email from an acquisition editor, which actually never happens to people that write. And she asked me if I was working on anything, and I said, well, I've just been sitting with this idea of putting together something for people who want to know about Howard Thurman but don't want to have to read 5 academic books. So she said, well, let's put a proposal together. And it was sort of during the pandemic. And so I had no excuse. In some ways, it turned out to be a calling. And I'll explain that a little bit more as we go along. But it became very clear to me that the Spirit was calling me to write this book. So everything that I needed to write it ended up at my doorstep one way or the other. And it's just extraordinary. Now, you might say, well, so why Howard Thurman? Well, the more I read about him, the more I was just amazed that this person, this spiritual leader, theologian, mystic, scholar, his life and wisdom is just impacted me, and I think knew that other people, it would do the same for them. So I'm going to do what I call a highlight tour. I'm kind of like a sideline college football fan. You know how they have the highlight reel. So I'm just going to sort of give you some highlights from the book so that you can kind of just get an idea about, what's in there. One of the first things that I want to highlight is that Howard Thurman was pretty much brilliant as a student and a child. He was born a contemplative. And, I think sometimes people think, well, can you be born a contemplative and a mystic? Yeah, you can. But it's like sometimes you don't realize it until you are exposed to other people who are either contemplatives or mystics. And you sort of, as Thurman would say, get a scent. So now Thurman was born in originally near Palm Beach, Florida, but his family settled in Daytona Beach. And this is actually the house that he was born in. And it is still there. It sort of needs a little, I would say, repair and work, but occasionally they do allow people to go in and out of it. And more recently, I heard that they were trying to raise some funds to sort of sort of make it a historical site, as well as to allow people to sort of tour the house. So on November 18th, 1899, was born. He was raised primarily by his mother and grandmother after his father died when he was 7 years old. And he happened to be in the room, by the way. His father worked for the railroad and would come home on weekends, but one day he came home in the middle of the week, and apparently he had pneumonia, and he really suffered with that for about 3 days and then passed away. And Thurman was there. And, there was a sort of an incident that occurred because his father was pretty much a more of an intellectual type, as opposed to one who went to church every Sunday with Thurman and his mother and grandmother. The local Baptist church that they attended refused to host the funeral because they said that he had died out of Christ because he wasn't a churchgoer. And so sort of a visiting preacher did the funeral, but basically condemned Thurman's father to hell because he had not gone to church. So this was one of those key things that got young Thurman, into thinking about what was this religion that was going on that would sort of condemn somebody for not going to church. But we'll come back to that. So he was did somebody say something? It's not loud enough? We're fine? Okay, all right. I thought somebody said something. All right, so he was an excellent student. His grandmother was with him much of the time and would really, you know, enforce this idea that education was a key to freedom for him. And so he did very well, but unfortunately, at the time in Daytona Beach and in the state of Florida, Black children or colored children, that's what they were called, could only matriculate up to the 7th grade, which by de facto eliminated high school for them. So his community, because he was so smart, decided that they would have him privately tutored so that he could pass the high school exam and go on to what was one of the few residential academies, this one in Jacksonville, so that he could finish and go on to high school. The picture of young Howard Thurman, just very well, dressed, etc. So he graduates valedictorian from the Florida Baptist Academy, and as a result, he receives a tuition scholarship to Morehouse College here in Atlanta. And then in 1923, he graduates as valedictorian from Morehouse College. And there's this story that he read every book in the library at the time. And it's not clear if that's really true, but I wouldn't be surprised. One summer he spent at Columbia studying philosophy, and actually thought about perhaps teaching. They were trying to recruit him to teach. He got both degrees in sociology and economics because one of his mentors, Mordecai Wyatt Johnson, told him he didn't need to study religion if he was interested in going to seminary because he was going to get those classes again. So nonetheless, he applied to the Rochester Theological Seminary. It's now called Colgate Rochester Theological Seminary, and received his graduated valedictorian of that school, which was a predominantly white institution and really sort of extraordinary for the time. He began his pastoral duties at the Mount Zion Baptist Church in Oberlin, Ohio. And I should say, right after that graduation from seminary, he married Katie Kelly, who became Katie Kelly Thurman, and then they left to go to Oberlin. He actually had quite a few people attend his church from the Oberlin College, and he stayed there until about 1928. Part of the problem was that his wife had caught tuberculosis. She had worked in the Atlanta branch of the Tuberculosis Association and needed to be in a warmer climate. So they moved back to Atlanta so that they could be closer to her family and have that kind of climate. And then he studies with Rufus Jones. So now what's really fascinating about this story is that one night, Thurman was attending a meeting on religious education, and he got kind of bored and he decided he was going to go outside and get some fresh air. So he goes out there, and on the way, there was this table full of books. And so he just, he looked over and he liked this title called Finding the Trail of Life. And I think he bought another book as well. And so he went outside and he sat down and read the whole book. And this book is really a story of the Quaker mystic Rufus Jones's childhood and how as a child he had these mystical experiences. And Thurman was like, well, wait a minute, this sounds like my life as a child. And, I need to go find this man and study with him. And so through what I call a series of holy coincidences, he ends up spending a semester studying mysticism, because he didn't get mysticism in the Baptist seminary that he went to, didn't get introduced to that. But what he realized was that there was an entire area of religion that was devoted to the kinds of experiences that he had had. I think his favorite mystic was Meister Eckhart. But he studied, all the, Francis of Assisi and everybody. And he had, had open access to Rufus Jones's library. But we're going to come back to that because that was a very important moment. Now, as I said, one of the first books that I started reading was Meditations of the Heart, because basically Thurman really shows his sort of contemplative approach to living, and particularly his emphasis on silence, stillness, and solitude. Now, let me just say that he didn't think that those were the only ways to connect with the presence, but he began to discover at a very young age that if you were still enough, that this sort of presence became more prominent and more accessible. And I just want to read, this is just a small excerpt from my book about how he got started in this. And so he says, I was a very sensitive child who suffered much from the violences of racial conflict. The climate of our town, Daytona Beach, Florida, was better than most Southern towns because of the influence of the tourists there. Nevertheless, life became more and more suffocating because of the fear of being brutalized, beaten, or otherwise outraged. In my effort to keep this fear from corroding my life and making me seek relief in shiftlessness, I sought help from God. I found that the more I turned to prayer, to what I discovered in later years to be meditation, the more time I spent alone in the woods or on the beach, the freer became my own spirit, and the more realistic became my ambition to get an education. So basically, Thurman started connecting in this way by being outside. That is sort of, I think, the place where he connected most with God. And that's another big theme in his life, is that if you're feeling kind of out of sorts, maybe you need to go outside. And so that was my connection with Thurman, because as a little girl, I used to like to go outside and sit in the wind. I found it very peaceful, very serene, and somehow or other, things just seemed to sort of calm down if I could just go outside and be quiet and sit in the wind. And when I began to read him, I thought, oh, wow, this sounds like, my life as a child. Now, there was one special tree that Thurman started basically meditating under. And there was a tree near his house. He basically had a relationship with this tree. He said that the tree kind of embraced him, connected with it, and that he really felt like the tree understood him. And, I don't know if any of you have this connection around trees, but trees are amazing. We think that the tree is still there. But he was really very much into just being still and sort of letting the presence kind of wash over him. He also talks a lot about walking the beaches, as well as some of the rowing along the Halifax River, and feeling like he was at one with everything. Like one, it was like life was being breathed through all of them. It's sort of like one lung. And I will say that he always recommended to people that they needed to be outside more. But he also was very high on what he called corporate or communal silence. So one of the things that he did when he was at Howard University as the dean of the Rankin Chapel, as well as at the the Church of the Fellowship of All Peoples, which he founded, first intentional interracial church in San Francisco, is that he basically offered a time before the service for people to sit in silence together. And he wrote some of the meditations and meditations of the heart, or the inward journey, for these times for people to come sit together. And he said that once he introduced this quiet time, that requests for pastoral counseling went down. And his theory was that somewhere in all of this stillness and silence, that people were able to be not only healed, but also to be able to their minds, or whatever problems that they had, were sort of illumined by this whole communal sense of oneness and connection. He also talks a lot about about rivers and streams and the ocean. And he was particularly intrigued with this idea that rivers are always trying to get to the sort of wider ocean. And he sort of saw that as a metaphor for us and our journeys towards God. That we are sort of on that stream, being shaped in many ways, so that we can get back to sort of this larger body. He loved creatures. He loved penguins. He actually even painted penguins. And he also believed in what he called common consciousness. He sort of felt like that we had a connection with all of creation, and that, sort of much of creation already sort of had that connection. That is, don't you wonder why it is that animals often know when an earthquake is coming or a tsunami is coming? And he said, basically we sort of often lose that consciousness unless we sort of pay attention. But I would call him a sacred environmentalist. He felt like that we needed to learn to respect and coexist with nature, that, we were all part of that. It was part of the divine presence. We were part of the divine presence, and that it was really, sad to him that we tend to exploit the environment as much as we do. But basically, he sort of felt like that no matter when it was, whatever season it was, that if you needed an uplift, you needed to go outside and catch some stillness, bask in some stillness. And I've actually done this on some retreats where I just send people outside. And I said, look, I want you to just be out there until you can catch a glimpse of stillness, and then just bask in it. And it really is sort of a remarkable kind of exercise. Second, the third sort of big theme for Thurman was know yourself. Now, Thurman was very fortunate to have both his grandmother and his mother. His grandmother had been a slave and survived. And so one of the things that she used to tell him and his two sisters, when that sort of idea of what it meant to be a Black child during Jim Crow kind of sank in, and they started to get kind of, I guess he would say, lose their sense of confidence or sense of happiness or aliveness. She would tell them this story. She would say, when I was a slave, they allowed an enslaved preacher to come and speak to us once a year. And he would give his sermon. And once he gave his sermon, he would say to each of us, looking directly in our eyes, you are not a slave. You are a holy child of God. And she just kept telling them the story every time she thought that they were losing confidence. Because what she wanted is to make sure that Thurman's self-concept, his identity, was embedded in this notion that he was actually from God. And any of this other stuff that other people had to say about him from the external, he didn't really need to be paying attention to, certainly as a way to define who he is. So he also had a mother, and I wish I had a good picture of her, but they're very hard to come by. She basically told Thurman back in 1910 when Halley's Comet came through, he was concerned that it was going to fall out of the sky. And she turned to him and she said, "Oh no," she said, "God will take care of us." And so one of the gifts that she gave him was this notion that no matter what was going to go, what was going on, God was going to take care of it. And so he was able to sort of internalize these things that help really in some ways to help him, be inoculated to some of the crazy madness that was going on around him. But he believed in the sanctity of the self. He believed that Jesus modeled this. And he talks a lot about this in his book, Jesus and the Disinherited, about how being aware that you are a child of God leads to higher self-esteem. And he basically, began to help us think about what is it that's in your self-concept that came from somebody else, and how much of yourself is actually coming from the inside as opposed to from the outside in. So he really felt that it was very important for us to have a very developed sense of self, because that is how it is that you are able to truly feel the sort of sense of worthiness that comes with your being a child of God. And he would often question people to find out if, in fact, they had done that sort of self-reflective work. Jesse Jackson talks about the time when, he went to go sit with him for some advice or whatever. And so he said, "Well, so who are you? Like, who is Jesse Jackson? And why are you here?" So, he was really trying to get past all of this, all these things that, we sort of attribute to ourselves because we're hanging out with a certain group or whatever. But it's like, do you know who you are? Because as far as he was concerned, if you were going to be a person who could resist or to act against injustice, you had to have an accurate portrayal of yourself. Not one that somebody else made up, but one that you knew to be true about yourself. And one of the ways that he also, by the way, he writes a lot about the self in this book, Deep is the Hunger. There's a whole section on his ideas about the self and how important, because he felt like Jesus realized that that was sort of where the action was. We'll come back to that. But in addition, he also understood that it was very important to make sure that, and let me back up for a second and say, one of his final addresses before he passed away was to the 1980 class of Spelman College. And it was baccalaureate address, and it was called "The Sound of the Genuine." And he basically, in this baccalaureate address, asked these graduates to think about, can you truly listen and hear the sound of the genuine in yourself? And so he, sort of basically, this is probably one of his more famous quotes about the sound of the genuine. Listening for the sound of the genuine in yourself, listening for the sound of the genuine in others, but really sort of knowing yourself so that you are not necessarily just following along, but you are living a life of authenticity. There's a reason why you're here. There's a reason why your unique idiom, as he would call it, is present in the world at this time. And that it was very important to be able to know what that is. It's a beautiful baccalaureate address, and I can tell you that if you either go to my site, LeritaColemanBrown.com, and click on the Howard Thurman page, it will take you to the digital archives of the Pitt Library at Emory University, where you can actually type in the sound of the genuine Howard Thurman and listen to the whole baccalaureate address. It's extraordinary. Or you can go to the Pitt Library, Emory University, Howard Thurman Digital Archives, and just type in the sound of the genuine. It's just lovely. Now, somehow or other, I've lost I seem to be in a different place. Hold on one second. Lost my... John, I'm having trouble with...
That's okay. Can you just, if you can't find it, you can just...
I'm good. I finally found
Okay.
it.
So it's about 20 of.
Okay. All right. I'm rolling along.
We're loving it.
Okay. Now, why am I not moving forward here? Oh, I'm stuck in a... Hold on one second. Okay. I'm going to stop sharing for a second and see if I can pull it back up again. Okay. Now, he also modeled prophetic spirituality and sacred activism. This is where the action is. All right, so let's just go back for a second to Rufus Jones. So when he went to study with Rufus Jones, Rufus Jones was a Quaker mystic. And of course, Quaker mysticism is very, and sometimes very different than the sort of mysticism that has come through the monastic tradition. The Quakers really believe that we all carry the light within us, every single person. And that, part of our role is to be able to live from that space of the divine which exists in us. So when Thurman studied with Rufus Jones, he suggested that there were different kinds of mysticism. And he said that affirmation mysticism does not require isolation or withdrawal from society or social life. And when you go inside to God, you come up in community or oneness. Affirmation mysticism also stirs a moral or ethical desire, which then suggests that mysticism or spirituality is not solely for your own personal spiritual growth. And that affirmation mysticism leads to social involvement, that is, righting injustices, ending warfare, because it's always about restoring the oneness, the unity, the creation. And so Thurman really, took to this idea He had a few little problems with, Rufus Jones in terms of his own personal kinds of issues around race and, mystics from other traditions that were not Christian. But he said, this is really going to impact the rest of the work that I do. So one of his first writings was in 1938, Mysticism and the Experience of Love. And he actually writes about different kinds of mystics, different kinds of mysticism. This pamphlet you can actually download as a Kindle on Amazon. It's up there, if you'd like to have that. It basically, like I said, he published this in 1939. He also continued to do more and more work on this kind of mysticism and published a book in the 1950s called The Creative Encounter. And this particular book even introduces what we now call neurotheology. That, every time we go in and make a connection with God, it should change us, not only sort of neurologically, but that eventually in our behaviors and in our thinking. Now, back while I was writing this book, there was a book published by Anthony Siracusa called Nonviolence Before King. And who he features in this book are Howard Thurman, Bayard Rustin, Pauli Murray, and James Lawson. And interestingly, he suggests that Thurman was talking about in his speeches, as well as writing about Jesus as a leader of a nonviolent religion as early as the late 1920s, and definitely in the 1930s when he went to Howard University and was head of the School of Religion. Thurman was a scrutinizer. He scrutinized the Gospels, and he really understood that there was something else going on. So that when he got invited to India to take a sort of 6-month tour, and I wish I could explain all of it, but it's explained in this book, Visions of a Better World, about how they got invited and sort of there was a Christian group, kind of like the YMCA, that wanted to be able to have some people that looked kind of like people that were from India to come over and kind of talk about religion, etc. And Thurman was not really up for that, but he was up for talking about what had happened with Black folks in the United States and how they survived slavery. And his wife talked about various things with having to do with women's history. And so they spent Thurman and his wife and Finola Carroll and his wife for about 6 months. And fortunately, towards the end of this visit, they were able to sit down and meet with Gandhi. And as I said, it's all in this book. Somebody had the sense enough to write, take notes, and it was an extraordinary meeting. And they talked about nonviolence. They talked about ahimsa. They talked about satyagraha. And it is true that Gandhi did say to Thurman that he thought that the unadulterated message of nonviolence would be manifest through the Black people in the United States. He told them to start small and sort of build up. And Thurman was very excited when he left there because he was like, oh, so here's another person who's thinking in the same sorts of ways that I'm thinking, although he's Hindu, and I'm, Thurman didn't really kind of call himself a Christian. Somebody called him out about being a Christian, and like, why would you be a Christian if, they're persecuting people like you, and they won't even let you sit in the same church? So Thurman said, well, I'm actually a follower of the religion of Jesus. He made a distinction between the religion of Jesus and the religion about Jesus. So, you know, between 1936, well, I should say just before that trip to India, he published an essay called Good News for the Underprivileged. And that particular essay became the basis for this book, Jesus and the Disinherited. And this was the book that really got people acting. But I should say that, you know, Thurman was a member of the Forum for Reconciliation, which included Bayard Rustin. And so there were a number of what were called direct nonviolent actions that occurred in the East and in the Midwest, you know, in the late 40s, early 50s, before the wider social civil rights movement that we think of as the civil rights movement. And even Polly Murray. And Polly Murray, who was an Episcopal, later became Episcopal priest, one of the first women, had a bus incident in 1944, for which she went to jail for. And she details that in her book, Songs of a Weary Throat. But there was a lot going on before King. Now, this is the part that I think blows people away. And I just have to talk about this. There are these connections that are just unbelievable between King and Thurman. Number one, Thurman's second wife, his first wife died, so Sue Bailey Thurman and Alberta King, the mother of King, were roommates in high school at Spelman Seminary. I mean, I sort of feel like Spirit was orchestrating this long before there was even a Martin Luther King Jr. Then, when the Thurmans came back from India, one of the first people that they sort of visited were the Kings here in Atlanta. And they had dinner. And Thurman would have, I mean, King would have been probably about 7 years old at the time. King's father, Daddy King, attended Morehouse while Thurman was there teaching to finish up his degree. Then King, as a seminary student, meets Thurman again on the pages of Jesus and the Disinherited, wrote a paper about it. Then they cross over again at Boston University, where Thurman is appointed the first Black faculty member and dean of the Marsh Chapel. And King used to attend some of his sermons and take notes. So there is this great, and then one more thing, when King was stabbed by a mentally ill woman in 1958, Thurman kept getting a vision of him on his, like he kept saying, I'm getting this vision of him. And he told his wife, he said, I've got to go find him. And he found him in Harlem Hospital. And he basically said, look, he said, you know, this movement that you've started, he said, it's taken on a life of its own. And I would suggest that you extend your recovery period and take some time for some silence and solitude so that you can begin to understand what is going to be your role in all of this. And it is after that that King goes to India and studies nonviolence and lays a wreath at the grave of Gandhi, because Gandhi had been assassinated by then. So I didn't grow up with that story, but now I understand what the story was about these connections between these two men. It's just unbelievable. So he's not the only person that read Jesus and the Disinherited. James Lawson read Jesus and the Disinherited. Jesse Jackson. There's tons of people that read this book and were ready to get into action. And that is just part of probably one of the most extraordinary contributions, as Father John says, is that this particular book really set off and I think gave people a sense of, oh, we can do this. And partly it was because Thurman addresses the state of Christianity, you know, why it was important for people to, you know, for people not only in the United States, but abroad who were dealing with anti-colonial and anti-imperialism efforts, that there needed to be a different interpretation of the Gospels. and that Jesus was the model for dispossessed and a leader of a nonviolent religion and non-cooperator with the Roman state. So it's just really an extraordinary book, and I would suggest that everybody read it. And I just want to say that, Thurman has some extraordinary things that he says in this book about how he thought Jesus was thinking about the dispossessed people that he was talking to. And so he was seeing the parallel between poor Jews like Jesus and Black people in the United States. And so he sort of was paid quite attention to some of the things that he said. He was real clear that sometimes people, have to do whatever they have to do to try to keep people in their place. He said Jesus recognized with authentic realism that anyone who permits another to determine the quality of their inner life. Just remember that. Quality of your inner life gives into the hands of the other the keys to their destiny. If a person knows precisely what he can say or what epithet they can hurl against you to make you lose your temper, lose your equilibrium, then they will always have you under subjection. This is so important. And, I call Jesus, I think Thurman thought Jesus was a psychological genius. Because it's really like, it's the inner that controls. And if somebody's got you all worked up or whatever, then they have the power. And this is so important in the times that we're living in. I keep telling people, we're just living in the Old Testament. People in the Old Testament do. If you can maintain your sense of centeredness and know that no matter what, God has not disappeared, it's important. So interiority is where the action is. How would you describe your inner life? What's the quality of it? What's the ambience or affect of it? And more importantly, who has control of it? Do you have control of your inner life? Or do other people have control of your inner life? So, and I always say it's very difficult to hear the guidance of the Spirit if you're sitting around ruminating or upset about something that somebody said. So, to just sort of end, after Thurman retired, I could be talking for another 2 or 3 hours, but after Thurman retired, he basically, went out and spoke a lot, just all over the place, and continued to do that until his health declined, and he passed away in 1981. But he really felt like everybody has a sacred call. And that, if in fact you are listening to the Spirit, that sometimes you have to step out of whatever times that you are in and receive that call and know that you will be okay in doing that. And so it takes courage, it takes trust. And this was sort of basically something that he had written for the new church that he started. But, sometimes people have to just step out there. He was always getting criticized for stuff, and he just didn't pay any attention to it. So his perennial questions were, who are you? Like, just really, who are you? What do you want, really? And who and what are you rooted in? Rooted in the world? Rooted in God? Rooted in whatever? Where are your roots? So, I talk a little bit more in the book about inner authority, which is basically, standing up for yourself, knowing that you have agency, knowing that you can set boundaries, knowing that you can say no, and inner authority with a capital I and a capital A, which is that you have asked the Spirit for guidance on whatever it is that you need to do. And I believe that in part, and there's evidence all over the place, that the civil rights movement was able to make as much progress as they did because they were leaning on inner authority. People were praying. King was, there's so many examples of him praying and asking for guidance about what to do next or where to go or what to say. And that when we are able to incorporate the Spirit's guidance, then we become sacred activists. Not just activists, but sacred activists, because we're cooperating with the Spirit in trying to get us back to the oneness. That's it.
Wow. So everybody, please join me in thanking Dr. Lerita Coleman Brown. Sort
I
of,
put a lot in there. Like I said, I could have
I
gone.
know, and you could talk for 3 more hours. We could listen for 3 more hours, but it was really beautiful. I think as an overall introduction to Thurman. So I'm truly grateful, and I was taking notes. And for me, he's so important. I can't get over that he was a friend of Gandhi and Martin Luther King, and a really critical person in both their lives, I've always thought. But, I was shocked and hooked on him. And these are the things I hope we can all get into as a mystic from birth. And, that story, I'm so glad you told the story of the oak tree. I kind of want to make a pilgrimage to that tree. And I think I will someday, because I thought he was like a Buddha figure. He was literally like Buddha sitting under the tree and becoming enlightened. And I think he was a Buddha, and he was an enlightened being for his whole life. The more time I spend in meditation, the less I'm afraid and the freer I am. Well, and he's doing this, for example, like some of us here are Merton students. He's 25, 30 years way before Merton. He's the only person I know that I've always, forgive me, bless me, for I have sinned. I've never liked Trappist Merton spirituality, which is the via negativa. It's Buddhist nothingness going into that. I call it, Lerita, Ignatian spirituality, the Jesuit Saint Ignatius. No, positive, the world, Jesus. And Thurman was like that and writing about that, as you said, before anybody. And I think he is a genius. And so, those questions are so basic. Who are you? What do you want? Who and what are you rooted in? We're going to need them as we go forward. Question of dignity. So let me begin by asking you a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up for people. Again, I want to ask people to please write a question for Dr. Coleman Brown in the chat. Let's start with the quote that you used for the title of your book, because I don't think you mentioned that. And I'll let you read the quote and talk about it's another way of saying what you're kind of summing up his message. What makes you come alive? And especially to read it for us today, because that was his genius.
Yes.
Because, Lerita, this culture wants us dead, and we want to be dead. We're being consumed left and right by the media, by the election, by war, by products, by money. And that's not the mystical path. It's not the way of nonviolence either. So talk to us first about that great quote which you used as the title for your book. Is that okay, Lerita?
Yes, absolutely. So, I have to say that people ask me all the time, where's that quote from? Where's that quote from? Well, basically,
And give us the quote too.
yes, yes.
I can give it to you if you don't have
No,
it
no,
handy.
no, 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 no. So the quote actually appears in an acknowledgement page by Gil Bailey, Baillie, in his book,
Yes, I do
Violence
too.
Unveiled. But he went to Thurman. He was trying to figure out what he was going to do next. So he went to Thurman and he said, I really don't know what to do next. And so he said, well, don't ask what the world needs. ask what makes you come alive and go do that, because what the world needs is more people who have come alive. And so, I love this quote. Although I did read an essay about why somebody hated this quote, but I love this quote because, sometimes I think we get caught up on, we should, that word should, we should be out there doing this, that, or the other. And what Thurman is trying to say is, pause. What would make you come alive? Because that's what is most important for you to take out into the world, whatever that is. And you can do that, whatever that is. So, like, for example, one of the things that makes me come alive is doing spiritual direction companioning. That's my not second career, but, I was a psychology professor for many years, but I'm much more alive than I was doing that, or gardening, and sometimes donating some of that produce to somebody. But there's so many ways we can contribute. But it's the aliveness that I think, Thurman believed in contagion. He said, you can't teach spirituality, but you can catch it.
That's wonderful. I'm thinking, it's another way of talking about God and inviting people into the fullness of God. And I am interested in him as a mystic and a revolutionary, which is what Henry Nouwen wrote about, but very few people talk about. But isn't that what Gandhi was, what Dr. King was? And Thurman is the person they look up to.
Yeah,
So,
but I'd love to read this quote to you.
yeah, go ahead. I want to ask you to tell us about how to be mystics and revolutionaries. What are you getting from Thurman? Any more helps on those questions? Go ahead with the quote.
I say that he found this relationship between mysticism and social change. Right?
Yes.
So that he could assert a prophetic spirituality. He says, social action is an expression of resistance against whatever tends to or separates one from the experience of God, who is the very ground of our being. The mystic's concern with the imperative of social action is not merely to improve the conditions of society. It is not merely to feed the hungry, not merely to relieve human suffering and human misery. If this were all in and of itself, it would be important, surely. But this is not all. The basic consideration has to do with the removal of all that prevents God from coming into himself in the life of the individual. Whatever there is that blocks this calls for action.
It's so beautiful. I think Gandhi would say in the individual and the whole human race too. You've got two questions here, Lerita. Okay. One is basically Glenn is asking who actually introduced him to nonviolence. But so he's saying, was it Rufus Jones? I think you're saying, I mean, you mentioned the form of reconciliation. You meant the fellowship of reconciliation.
Oh, yeah.
So I was the head of the Fellowship of Reconciliation in the 90s, and I know of Howard Thurman friendship with friends, but FOR was publishing in 1920. So Thurman was reading Gandhi from 1920 and reading about nonviolence through the Fellowship of Reconciliations in the U.S. as early publications back in 1919 in World War I. So I think Jones was as well. FOR was the source of everything. Dorothy Day was the secretary there. If you have any more thoughts on that, and then someone asks, okay, how can we go on a retreat with you, and where do we find you? So that's a happy question. You can give a little commercial plug. So tell us about how did Thurman find all this? And was it Rufus Jones? I don't think it was. You tell us.
No, but I think that I think that Thurman certainly he was widely read, and he was, like I said, one of those people that just would work on something and work on something and work on something. And I think that after he spent some time with Rufus Jones and really sort of started trying to make this connection between mysticism and social change, that he also at the same time felt this strong need to understand Christianity as it was, as it was expressed to him. And that he really was studying Jesus,
Yeah.
and what Jesus was saying and doing, et cetera. And he realized that, this man was not attacking anybody. He was, it was all, and even, with the Roman soldiers and, whatever, he basically was just expressing love all the time, just love all the time. So I think it was really through, how sometimes you're just in the really sitting with something, and then all of a sudden awareness comes over you. I think that's how it really happened. That he began to see Jesus as a leader of a nonviolent religion. When he came back from India, he gave a series of lectures on the importance, of Jesus, and one of them, he really talks about how that we are created by God, and so there's no reason. I mean, our worth has already been established, and that there should be nothing that gets in the way of our connection. So he talks about money and sort of all these kind of semi idols that can be can prevent us from staying sort of connected, but that they're just sort of an extraordinary set of exercises of, I shouldn't say exercises, of essays, in which he just sort of goes through his sort of reading of the gospel. And one of them has to do with the fact that Jesus was basically about love, and not, he said, the people thought he had come as a Messiah, to lead a revolution. But the revolution really wasn't about armed revolution. It was about, this switching this eye for eye to a more loving way of being in the world.
That's great. Yeah.
Yeah. And so some people were just really disappointed, right? That the person that they thought was going to come save them was not going to be leading an armed revolution. There's enough stuff going on, by the way, at that time anyway. Enough
So
skirmishes.
important, Lerita. My whole life's work has really been trying to teach the world the nonviolence of Jesus, and therefore Christians have, and I've always studied that and the history of that. And you could go back to Schweitzer and you won't find it, but you really go back to the great, great, great leader of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, Andre Trocme, who was very famous in France for saving 1,000 Jews in his community in the south of France. But he was the head of FOR in Europe. And he wrote the first great book, Jesus and the Nonviolent Revolution. Howard is way before him, but they would have known each other. And, but Howard is really writing, and he's a friend of Gandhi, and he's talking about Jesus when very few are. And the same today, by the way, in religions, we'll talk about everything but Jesus and what did Jesus want. I got a long letter from a priest yesterday saying, all this peace and nonviolence is all good, but we got to kill people. And I wrote back, it's like, well, what about Jesus? And so Howard was really ahead of his time in so many ways.
He was so ahead of his time in so many different ways. I mean, you read some of the stuff and you're just like going, oh, this man is like, and he was just way ahead of his time. I mean, just
so he
church,
Yeah, he influenced I think he influenced Merton. I think they corresponded. He influenced
Well,
Stringfellow.
what
Go
we
ahead.
know is that we know that Thurman knew of Merton, but we don't know that Merton knew of Thurman. We know that Thurman knew about Merton. We don't know if Merton knew about Thurman. I've talked
I'm
to some
pretty
folks
sure,
about.
and I will get back to you on that.
I
Because
would
and
please.
David
I'd
will
like to
too.
know.
Yeah.
I'd like to know that because I've talked to many Merton people and they keep saying they don't know. But
Yeah.
he wrote a paper about Thurman and his connection to Merton.
That's great.
Thurman was aware of him. Yes.
Tell us about the last years and the importance of the church in San Francisco. You know, how Thurman was driven out, and in the end, left the academic world and created the first interracial kind of church about universal love. That was, I mean, there are many like that now. I think I may be wrong, but he was really a first in that. Or like it wasn't koinonia in the 50s or the 40s, but it was a church, and how that was like for him the culmination of his life's work, wouldn't you say?
Well,
Maybe not. I don't know. I'm asking.
I mean, that was one thing, right?
Hmm.
But I think he was always trying to figure out how he could, one, um, uh, help people feel that sense of the presence. And some people would leave his sermons and say, wow, I thought Jesus was in the room, kind of thing, right? Because I mean, and again, you could go to that archive and listen to his sermons. He's got some extraordinary sermons. I mean, they have one at Boston, but that archive is not working as well as it used to. But, I've listened to like 12 sermons on Jesus and the Disinherited that he, gave in the 50s. But I think that he was struggling with trying to understand how he could create this sense of presence for other people that was so strong for him, and that he was trying to help more and more people to change inwardly. So, for example, he said, you can change all the laws in the world, because I mean, he saw, that change from Jim Crow to 1980. I mean, that's a long way. But he said, if you don't change people's hearts, it's not going to matter. And that's what we're seeing right now, right?
Hmm.
We've got these laws that sort of say, okay, it's okay for everybody to do this, that, or the other, but obviously people's hearts have not caught up. So, but Thurman was a person who was truly one who was following the spirit, the voice of the spirit. So he was at Howard University, but when he went to India, while he was there, he had a vision. He was at Khyber Pass, and he looked over and saw this caravan of going into Afghanistan, and he knew that those people were his people. And so he decided that when he got back to the United States, that he really wanted to find out if people from different religions, different ethnic groups, different races could worship the same God in the same place.
Hmm.
So, he got back in, 1936. In 1943, I've just forgot his last name. Albert Fisk wrote him and said, do you know any seminarians who might want to come start this church in San Francisco? And Thurman was thought, I don't know, maybe I want to go do that, right? And so, he prayed about it and listened, and, was going to try to get another leave. And his president said, I'm not giving you another leave. You're just going to have to figure this out. So on a wing and a prayer, pretty much, he didn't even know how he was going to be able to survive, financially, at least. He left the School of Religion. He got criticized by all kinds of people saying, well, why are you leaving the students? And, blah, 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 blah. And he said, because I need to go do this. So he actually left and started this church. And there were all kinds of people, and he had actually what they would call uh, members at large. So Eleanor Roosevelt was a member at large. And he had all kinds of people there. And actually, somebody has written a book. There's always a book. This one is called The Fellowship Church, Howard Thurman and the 20th Century Religious Left by Amanda Brown. So it's really, but he also wrote his own book on the church called Footprints of a Dream, and how he came to starting this church, and how they sort of decided together the kinds of things that they were going to do. And of course, they were upset when, Boston University president, because, Thurman was always out there talking, regardless of whether or not, and sometimes he would give lectures to support the church. So he had someone to, the president contacted him and said, we'd like you to come to Boston University and be our dean, blah, 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 blah. And he said, okay, well, let me think about that. And of course, he brought the family together because, he had a family. That was a big change. And so the president contacted him again, and he told him, he said, I'm waiting for a word in my heart. Or some people say, I'm waiting for a sign. I'm waiting for a word in my heart. And when he got that word, he left the church, and people were just so upset because, he left the church, but he felt like he really sort of felt like he could be exposed, he could expose more people internationally, students. Yeah. He involved the community and in sort of church activities. And he had what ended up being what he called the chapel project, where he wanted to create a space for all the different groups. So, Jewish space, a place for the Muslim students to pray, and, and all of that. And unfortunately, the board of trustees of this Methodist-based church, school, were not ready in the 1960s.
Yeah.
We're like, no, we're not doing this.
So, Lerita, I want to call on David to ask questions. So you'll see in the chat, someone's asking what's the name of the group. That's the Fellowship of Reconciliation. You could look up their website, forusa.org, study the history. Kathy has written a nice thank you note in the chat to you, Lerita. So David's going to ask you a question. I'm going to let him ask you about what Martin Luther King found helpful. And I want to connect it to, I think, a question if Jim Lawson were here, he would ask you. Jim was my great friend who just died this summer. Yeah. Just a few months ago, Jim Lawson was on the phone to me talking about the religion of Jesus. So that whole phrase of Howard Thurman's was critical for Jim Lawson, and therefore I think critical for Martin Luther King. Because I heard Jim Lawson talking about it all the time, and I was always going, huh? I liked how you say versus the religion about Jesus. But what Jim and everybody got is the first sentence in Jesus and the Disinherited. So if you want to say a word about this, and then I'll talk to Dave, or not. And that's just this business of the backs against the walls, Lerita. I'm going to read the sentence. Because basically, this week, a lot of us are mourning the death of Gustavo Gutierrez, the great founder of liberation theology. He was a great guy. I knew him and loved him. The last I was with him was in El Salvador a couple of years ago. Very funny and fun, but he kind of invented the theology on the side of the oppressed. No, it's all in Howard Thurman, because the first sentence is,
yes,
it's really amazing. The Thurman guys. So this is the first two sentences of Howard Thurman, and then I'm going to call on David. Many and varied are the interpretations dealing with the teachings and life of Jesus of Nazareth. So right there, the whole book is, okay, we're talking about Jesus. But few deal with what those teachings and the life of Jesus have to say to those who stand at this moment in human history with their backs against the wall. And that was Thurman's thesis after being with Gandhi and being in India. How does Jesus help those with their backs against the wall? If some of us are overprivileged white people, don't have our backs against the wall, we don't understand Jesus, much less Thurman or Gandhi and King. So let me ask David to ask you. David knew Dr. King, probably knew Howard Thurman, and then Lerita, you can respond, and then we'll begin to wrap it up. So welcome, David. David is a long time peace and justice civil rights activist from the Bay Area.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Lerita, for your very helpful presentation. I had the opportunity back in the early 60s at a Quaker conference in Virginia, or in Indiana, where Howard Thurman gave the morning meditation each morning. And it was one of the most powerful, spiritual experiences of my life. I mean, it was like Jesus was there. God was there. But my question is, what your whole presentation has been about this, but if you could share any more about why, for King, Howard Thurman was so very important. So much so that he carried his book with him everywhere he went, including to jail.
So I think the contents of this book helped a lot of people. It's almost like a blueprint to creating the civil rights movement. Basically what it does, I mean, and just the two sentences that Father John just read, Thurman's question was, because it goes back to what kind of religion is this? Like, why would Black people, well, let me just back up for a second and say, when he was in India, they asked him, they said, why are you a Christian? I mean, people, these Christians are, they won't let you sit next to them in the service. And then they'd stop service and have a lynching and come back and like, what? How could any person, of dark skin belong to anything that's like that? So that's when Thurman made this distinction between Christian, because I don't think he would call himself a Christian. He would say, I'm a follower of the religion of Jesus. Because the Christianity that was being presented to him was not helpful, right? At some point, and you can look up the history whenever you'd like, at some point, Christianity got institutionalized by the state and became a force for colonialism and imperialism. And so Thurman's thinking, well, so why should any Black person want to follow this religion? So he had to sit with that question. Like, why would I want to be a Christian? I mean, is there anything in the Gospels that Jesus says that would help the person whose back is against the wall? And that wasn't just, it was Black people pretty much in 1939, but, that's also, people that we consider to be, illegal immigrants or, women, or, I could just go down the line. Where they are sort of, as he calls, have been cast to the margins of society. They're dispossessed, they're dismissed. And, how do you become a worthy person of dignity? And is there anything that Jesus has to say that can help you? So I think that he really felt like he needed to go through the Gospels thoroughly to see what it was, if there were any parts of it that would help people to be able to live fuller lives. And what he found was that it was in the life and the actions of Jesus. That was the religion of Jesus. What was Jesus doing every day? How did he talk to people? What did he say? That was the religion of Jesus.
And is that what Dr. King found helpful, that reminder?
Well, in addition to the fact that Thurman makes these parallels between the situation that Jesus was in and what Jesus said to his people, and the religion and the situation that Black people were in at the time. See, so basically, if you really read underneath the lines here, what Thurman has laid out is that Jesus told his people, protect your inner sanctuary. Know who you are, protect your inner sanctuary. Don't let whatever these other people are telling you about yourself to become internalized. Be the worthy person. Your worth has already been established by God. You do not have to earn it, and there's no question about it. So I think that's what spurred all of these people, was like, oh, wow. We don't have to sit around and wait. Until we get to heaven, right? To get any relief here. If we know who we are and we stand in that center of God, then we now have the tools to resist.
Yeah, because then they were able to non-cooperate with the culture. They were doing it interiorly and then organizing, but then they kept going further and found that Jesus marched to Jerusalem and you can take action. And they were figuring that out with also the example of Gandhi. It's all terrific, huh?
Yeah, if you read particularly that last chapter on love,
yeah.
Thurman really challenges people to say, wait, when that person, does that slur or slaps you in the face, you need to be able to stand your ground or stand centered, but also to try to respond in a way that is so loving that perhaps maybe you will awaken the child of God in them. Because if they knew they were a child of God, they would not be trying to prevent you from being.
So Thurman he was a real spiritual teacher for King, Jim Lawson, Jesse Jackson, John Lewis, everybody, and gave an authority. And another way to put that was, no one was saying that like that with an academic background, who knew Gandhi, who was published, who'd been around for decades, and was such a stand-up quality person, a great guy.
Well, I mean, just think about him being a mystic.
Yeah, he modeled this in a way they didn't know what he was talking about.
That's right. And so he wasn't worried about what people were thinking. He wasn't worried about institutions, because he knew that he was standing in God. He's rooted in God.
So, Lerita, we have to end, but I want to ask you to give us a last word about going forward today. What I take from you is that we all need to do all of that too. Yes. Not to be afraid, to be totally and more than ever rooted in God, to go deep into the mystical contemplative roots of our identity and claim our dignity, Black and white, rich and poor, whoever we are, and to non-cooperate with this whole culture of violence and injustice and racism and war, but to be people of the spirit like Howard, and to let God make us come alive and to do new things and to trust. One of the amazing things about Howard is he's not going to make any difference. He's not Gandhi, but he trusted, and his life bore really good fruit that we don't even understand yet. I don't think he's still. So any final words for us in this bad moment that we're living through in light of Howard? And then we'll end with that.
Yes. Well, as I say to people, so many people, just think you're living in the Old Testament. And what did the people of the Old Testament do? They trusted God. Right? I mean, they hung in there. And some people say, well, they were wandering around in the desert for 40 years, 40 nights. Well, Walter Brueggemann said that it's whatever it takes, whatever long it takes, right? We're part of something much bigger, I think is about an awakening. And if we can stay centered, if we can engage in the spiritual practices that keep us calm and at peace, if we can trust, if we can each day get up and ask Spirit, what is it that you have for me to do today? What is it that I need to say? What is it that I don't need to say? And, how can I contribute to peace? How can I contribute to more people coming alive? I do not have my television on all day. I watch enough news to be informed so that if something's happening, I know what to do. But, there's so many other ways in which I can bring something more life-giving to my mind, to my spirit. I say read more Howard Thurman, right? But do those kinds of things that are going to help you to stay centered in a peaceful way in your own inner life. I think everybody needs to take a pause and look at their inner life and the degree to which you are allowing other people to control it. If you're sitting around worried and anxious every day and you can't sleep because the election is in a week, then what are you rooted in? Maybe you need to think, okay, what is it that I can do so that I am not allowing all this other stuff to influence my peace and joy? God gave us peace and joy. We want to stay in that.
Amen. Well, that's a mighty blessing for all of us. May we all stay rooted in the peace and joy that Dr. Lerita Coleman Brown is inviting us to. Thank you so much for teaching us about the great Howard Thurman and encouraging us on our journey. And I wish you all the best, Lerita. It's fun listening to you, and let's stay in touch. Please join me in giving a big, round, rousing show of applause. It's deafening, Lerita, as we thank you.
And somebody asked the question about retreats. Go to my website. I usually keep an events page, so if something's happening.
So tell us again, it's LeritaColemanBrown.com, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. So thank you very much. My commercial announcement is 2 weeks from now, November 9th. John Dominic Crossan will be with us. Many consider him the greatest living Christian scripture scholar, like on the planet. And he has a big new book on Paul out. And come, everybody, and meet the great man. And that's wonderful. And then we'll have Judith Valente in December talking about Thomas Merton and his ways of helping us in global crises. And then my friend Carrie Kennedy, daughter of Robert and Ethel Kennedy, who's been working on human rights for 40 years. I think she's starting off the new year with us, but you can check it all out at beatitudecenter.org. Thanks, Lerita. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to turn off the recording now, but if you want to stay on and debrief, Lerita, you don't have to stay on, but anyone else says I have a few more minutes. God bless everybody and see you next time.